We all, here are probably familiar with this history, but maybe not all the intricacies of it. And that history is how we came to be a segregated country, how all cities and counties around the country, like Marin, are segregated by race, where whites live in some neighborhoods and African Americans in other neighborhoods. And this has been a consistent pattern of how our communities looked for decades in this country and is consistent all over the country in all regions of the country. And we have told ourselves in this country that that is just a sort of naturally occurring phenomenon. It's just, how we self-sort into neighborhoods where people look like us, or that it was a result of private actors, like bigoted landlords or realtors or mortgage brokers who refuse to sell or rent to African Americans in white neighborhoods. And so our segregated neighborhoods are, the reason they're segregated is either because of some magical occurrence or an accident, or just private bad apples, private bad actors in the private real estate market. And when we understand it that way, we not only let the government off the hook, but we also let ourselves off the hook, because we think when something happened by accident, it can only unhappen by accident. We don't have any responsibility to change it or any agency to change it. So in that was, it's still a very prevalent way of understanding how our cities look the way they do. And to that idea, my dad wrote The Color of Law to debunk that, it's called de facto segregation explanation, this explanation that it wasn't caused by laws or policies or by the government. That whole book is filled with examples of government policies and programs and actions that intentionally and explicitly created racially segregated communities, often in places where the cities were racially integrated before those government policies came in, and then separated races into separate neighborhoods. And those government policies, they didn't just separate people into separate neighborhoods, but they segregated resources into neighborhoods differently and unequally. As we all are familiar with, it's evident here in Marin County, races are segregated into different parts of the county. The areas that are predominantly white are well-resourced areas with well-resourced public schools and open space and clean air and far from freeways and access to jobs and transportation. And the areas where African Americans were limited to living because of explicit government policy, they're closer to freeways. This is true around the country, closer to freeways, more pollution, more older buildings with lead paint, less well-resourced public schools and public services, less access to jobs and transportation to get there. So we have created a society where we live in unequal neighborhoods based on our race. And even though those laws that have created that racial landscape of our neighborhoods, though many of the policies that created that have been changed, they've been challenged, they've been struck down. We now have the Fair Housing Act that was passed in 1968 that says you can't discriminate by race in the sale and rental of housing, which is great, but those racial patterns still persist because we haven't addressed sort of the long ongoing impacts of the initial segregation of resources and races by neighborhood. So an example of that is, like happened here in Marin, when the federal government helped to subsidize the white middle class into home ownership, it did so on a racialized discriminatory basis. So like many homes here in Marin have these racially restrictive covenants on the deeds of their homes that say that the home can only ever be owned or occupied by whites. Those restrictive covenants were required by the federal government for the developers who built those homes, who got federal subsidies to build those homes in places like here in Marin County and in subdivisions and suburbs all over the country, required to put this racially restrictive language on the deeds of those homes that prohibited explicitly African Americans from living in those neighborhoods. Now those homes, they were affordable when the white families who were first allowed to buy them, bought them. They got into home ownership at an affordable price, which isn't true anymore in home ownership. Those homes appreciated in value exponentially over the generations. Those homes that cost about $100,000 in today's money when the federal government first helped to create and suburbanize the country and create a middle class through home ownership. Those homes, not here in Marin County, they don't cost $100,000 anymore. So the families who got into home ownership when it was affordable, they've built wealth over generations that they then use to send their kids to college, to enjoy their retirements, or to pass down wealth to their kids and grandkids to buy their own homes. So this is why, even though the Fair Housing Act prohibits discrimination in the future, it doesn't rectify that disparity, that wealth disparity that exists because of explicit government policy. So if we are to challenge segregation and to redress it, meaning remedying the harms that it has caused, we need to look to the future to ensure that we don't continue to create segregated neighborhoods going forward, and we need to look to the past and rectify and remedy those ongoing harms that exist because of past government policy. So how do we do that? Well, as Barbara mentioned, we wrote a whole book about it. But the book, what we describe is that to remedy segregation and redress its harms, we need to activate the civil rights movement around the country to take on segregation, which the civil rights movement of the 60s and 70s made a lot of huge gains in racial equity, but it left residential segregation virtually untouched. And so we believe that we need to re-energize the civil rights movement to then take on residential segregation head on. And to do that, we need to start locally, because even though the federal government had a large role to play in creating segregation, once our neighborhoods were initially segregated, they stayed that way to a large extent because of local policy. So we can focus on local issues that are controlled by our local city councils or county board of supervisors or planning commissions or school boards. Those local policies and programs can go a long way towards either maintaining segregation or challenging it. So there's a lot we can focus on locally that can make a big difference. We also have a little bit more control over local policies than we do over federal policy, especially right now. If we believe that we can only make change by focusing on federal policy, we would be sitting here for a long time waiting for something to happen, especially today. So in the meantime, there's a lot that can be done on the local level. I didn't realize that Come to the Table came out of the talk I gave in Marin last year, but that's one thing that we argue or recommend in the book, is that to build this new civil rights movement, we need to start by building relationships across racial lines in our own communities. And that takes some intentional steps, like Come to the Table, like having dinner together with people from other parts of your same county that you might not otherwise have contact with. Because when we live in segregated communities, we see people who look like us, and we need to build these kinds of relationships so we can build the kinds of committees and coalitions that are strong enough, that include Blacks and whites and Latinos and other ethnicities all working together and all sharing leadership. And to do that, we need to develop some trust and some shared understanding of how we got here and be able to really work together to do that. So I got to join the dinner tonight, and it was lovely, and it was great, and I love that came out of this, because this is what we need to sort of get started, to then start talking about these issues and understand what kind of power we have together in our own communities to start to change it.